Elizabeth sat in her cozy office, reviewing the last quarter's reports. She rubbed her eyes tiredly, putting her glasses aside. 32 years. That's how long she and William had been building their business, a chain of cozy coffee shops that had become a favorite destination for many of their townspeople. Mrs. Elizabeth, Anna, their secretary, knocked on the door. Mr. William asked me to tell you that he won't be able to make it to the meeting with the suppliers today. He said he had an urgent doctor's appointment. Elizabeth looked up, feeling something cold squeeze her heart. Again? That's the third time in 2 weeks. Is he okay? He didn't say, Anna shrugged. He just asked me to reschedule all his appointments. When the door closed behind the secretary, Elizabeth went to the window. Downstairs, life was bustling. People were hurrying about their business, coming into their coffee shop. Everything was as usual, but something had changed. She could feel it with her whole being. William was different. At first, it was small things, missed calls, constant delays at work, refusing to have dinners together. Then came these mysterious doctor's appointments. Elizabeth tried to remember the last time they had a normal conversation about something other than work. "Good afternoon, dear," her husband's voice suddenly sounded. William stood in the doorway, elegant as ever in his gray suit. "Oh, you're still here?" Elizabeth tried to make her voice sound casual. "I thought you had already left for the doctor." William hesitated for a moment. "Yes, I was just about to. I just forgot some papers. Should I come with you?" Elizabeth asked, looking at her husband intently. "I'm worried." No need to." He quickly waved her off. "It's just a routine check. By the way, I'll be back late tonight. Don't expect dinner." When the door closed behind William, Elizabeth slowly sank into her chair. She pulled out their wedding photo from the drawer. Young, happy, full of dreams and hopes. Back then, they had started in a small coffee shop, working day and night, supporting each other. "Mrs. Elizabeth," Anna reappeared. "I'm sorry, but the suppliers are already waiting in the conference room." "Yes, of course." Elizabeth stood up decisively. "I'm going to go." She took one last look at the photo and put it back in the drawer. Something told her that everything would change soon, and these changes would be painful for both of them. The day dragged on endlessly. After the meeting with the suppliers, Elizabeth tried to focus on her work, but her thoughts kept returning to her husband's strange behavior. In the evening, sitting alone in their large house, she remembered how they had once dreamed of a home like this. Now it seemed too empty and cold. At 12:30, she heard the front door open. William's footsteps were quiet, as if he didn't want to be noticed. "Are you still up?" he asked, seeing the light in the kitchen. "I've been waiting for you," Elizabeth replied. "How was the doctor's appointment?" "I'm fine." He avoided her gaze. "I'm just tired. I'm going to go to bed." Elizabeth watched him go up the stairs and felt a heavy lump grow in her chest. William smelled of expensive women's perfume. That morning, Elizabeth woke up earlier than usual. William was no longer there. His half of the bed was cold and neatly made. This had become commonplace lately. She slowly walked to the window, feeling the day begin hard. It was only 5:30. "He must have gone to his morning meeting again," she muttered to herself, trying to suppress a bitter smile. Elizabeth went downstairs to make coffee. The silence in the house was almost unbearable. As she passed William's office, she noticed that the door was slightly ajar. It was strange. Her husband always locked them. "William?" she called out, even though she knew there would be no answer. Elizabeth hesitated for a moment before entering. In 32 years of marriage, she had never violated her husband's personal space. But something was pushing her to do it now. The office looked as it always did. Perfect order, everything in its place. On the table were neatly folded papers, a notebook, and an envelope. An ordinary white envelope, but for some reason it immediately caught her attention. "Oh God, what am I doing?" Elizabeth whispered, taking the envelope in her hands. Inside were photographs. In the first one, William was hugging a young woman, about 35 years old. They were standing in front of a restaurant, both smiling and happy. In the second, the same woman was sitting at a table in one of their coffee shops. In the third, Elizabeth felt her legs give out. She sank heavily into her chair, continuing to flip through the photos. Her hands were shaking. The envelope also contained a letter written in a neat woman's handwriting. "My dear William." "Mrs. Elizabeth?" a voice suddenly said behind them. Their housekeeper, Martha, who had worked for them for 15 years, stood in the doorway. "You're here so early. Has something happened?" Elizabeth quickly put the photos back in the envelope. No, Martha. I just couldn't sleep. Could you please bring me some coffee in my office? You are pale as a wall." The old woman came closer. "Should I call a doctor?" "No need." Elizabeth forced a smile. "I've just been tired lately." Back in her office, Elizabeth locked the door and pulled out her phone. Her hands were still shaking as she dialed the number for their family lawyer. "Good morning, Robert. I'm sorry to call you so early. Yes, it's urgent. Can we meet today?" "Great, I'll be there at 10. After hanging up, Elizabeth walked over to the large window of her office. The workday was already beginning downstairs, with their coffee shops opening and employees rushing to their places. Everything was as usual, but the world would never be the same for her. At 9 o'clock, William came into the office. "Good morning, dear. You're here early today." "Yes, I have a lot of work to do," she replied calmly, not turning around. "Do you have any meetings again?" "Yes, I'll be late. Don't expect dinner." "Okay." She finally turned around and looked at him. "Good luck with your meetings." When the door closed behind William, Elizabeth took the envelope with the photos out of her purse. Now she knew the truth, and she knew what she had to do next. But William must not realize that she knows everything. At least not yet. Dialing the number of her best friend Margaret, she spoke. "Hello, dear. I need your advice. And I need the number of a judge you know. Yes, that judge. Don't ask me why. Just trust me. It's very important." After hanging up, Elizabeth looked at the photos again. The sun was shining outside the window. A new day was beginning, and she felt strangely calm. Now that she knew the truth, it was time to act, but to act wisely and carefully. "Anna," she called her secretary, "please prepare all the financial reports for the last year, and the ownership documents for all our coffee shops. Yes, every single one of them." Elizabeth sat in her lawyer's office, listening intently to his every word. Robert Peterson, a gray-haired man in an expensive suit, was holding a folder of documents she had brought him. "Well, Mrs. White, the situation is quite serious." He took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. "It seems that your husband has been preparing for this for a long time. Over the past 8 months, he has re-registered the rights to 3 new coffee shops exclusively to himself." "But how is that possible?" Elizabeth clenched her hands into fists. "We always registered everything together. He used your powers of attorney. Do you remember signing any documents recently?" Elizabeth remembered how a few months ago William had brought her a stack of papers. "Honey, this is just routine documentation. You trust me, don't you?" At that moment, the door to the office opened abruptly. A courier stood on the threshold. "Mrs. Elizabeth White? Yes, it's me. You have a summons to appear in court." With trembling hands, Elizabeth opened the envelope. Robert leaned over to read the document. "William is filing for divorce and is seeking a division of property. He claims that he is entitled to 70% of the business because he has been leading the expansion of the network on his own for the past 5 years. Elizabeth felt her chest tighten. 70%? But this is my whole life. We started together with nothing. I worked on a par with him. Moreover, Robert continued to read the documents. He demands an urgent hearing. The hearing is scheduled for next week. So soon? He has good connections in the court, and a very expensive lawyer, Michael Donovan. Elizabeth shuddered. Michael Donovan was known for his ruthlessness in litigation. Well, she straightened up in her chair, that means we need to get ready. Robert, I need copies of all documents for the last 10 years, all contracts, all financial statements. It will take time. We don't have that time. I know my husband. If he decides to act, he will fight to the last. The following days turned into a nightmare for Elizabeth. During the day, she worked on paperwork, and in the evening, she held urgent meetings with coffee shop managers, trying to maintain control of the business. William no longer came home. He told her through his lawyer that he would temporarily live in a hotel. On the day of the trial, Elizabeth woke up before dawn. She stood in front of the mirror for a long time, choosing her clothes. She decided on a strict navy blue suit, the same one she wore when she opened their first coffee shop 32 years ago. The courtroom was crowded. Elizabeth spotted several of their employees, old friends, even competitors. Everyone had come to watch the breakup of one of the city's most successful business couples. Everybody up! Court is in session. As the judge entered the courtroom, Elizabeth felt the ground slipping away from under her feet. Sitting at the judge's table was Thomas Burns, her old university friend whom she hadn't seen in almost 20 years. "The case of the divorce and division of the property of the White family," the clerk announced. Michael Donovan, William's attorney, stepped forward. "Your Honor, my client seeks an equitable division of the marital estate. In recent years, it has been Mr. White who has led the expansion of the business, negotiated important contracts, and made key decisions. His wife had effectively stepped away from the business, focusing on representative functions." Elizabeth felt her breath catch in her throat with indignation. But she forced herself to sit calmly, only clenching her hands tighter. "What's more," Donovan continued, "it was Mr. White's business acumen that made the coffee shop chain so successful. We have all the documents to prove his personal contribution to the business." Judge Burns listened intently, taking notes. His face remained impenetrable. "Mrs. White," he said to Elizabeth, "do you agree with these statements?" Elizabeth slowly stood up. The room fell silent. "Your Honor," her voice was quiet but firm, "I would like to present some documents to the court." After the first court hearing, Elizabeth sat in her lawyer's office. It was already dark outside, but she didn't want to go home. There were too many memories. "We need a new strategy." Robert was flipping through papers. "Donovan is playing hardball. He's trying to present you as a decorative figure in the business." Elizabeth smiled bitterly. "Decorative? I still remember when we opened the first coffee shop. You know, Robert, back then, we didn't even have money for a professional designer. I painted the walls myself, sewed curtains, made the menu." She went to the window. "We worked 18 hours a day. William stood at the cash register. I made coffee. For the first 3 months, we couldn't afford to hire a single employee. And then, tell me everything." Robert took out a new notebook. "Every detail. We need to show the court your real contribution to the business. Do you know what's most interesting?" Elizabeth returned to the table. "The idea for the coffee shops was mine. Back then, 32 years ago, William worked as an accountant for a large company. He dreamed of a promotion, of a career. And I saw how people come into small coffee shops in Europe, how they socialize, how they relax." She took an old photo out of her purse. "This is our first coffee shop. Paradise is what we called it. I came up with the name myself." William laughed at first, saying it sounded too pretentious. But it was this name that attracted the attention of our first customers. "What about the financial side?" Robert took notes. "Do you have any documents from those days?" "Oh, not just any." Elizabeth opened her briefcase. "Here, take a look. This is my diary for the first year of work. I wrote down every purchase, every bill, even recipes for new desserts. Everything is here." Robert took the worn notebook. "This can be very important evidence. It shows your direct involvement in business management from the very beginning." At that moment, there was a knock on the door. It was Robert's secretary. "I'm sorry, but Judge Burns is here to see Mrs. White." Elizabeth flinched. "Thomas? But that's unethical. He said it was an off-the-record conversation, a private matter." Elizabeth looked at Robert. He nodded slowly. "It's your right to accept or refuse." "Okay." She stood up. "I'll talk to him." Thomas was waiting in the small break room. He had taken off his judge's robe and looked tired. "Hello, Liz. How many years? How many winters?" 22 years, Thomas," she answered quietly. "Since you went to Europe to study." He nodded. "I didn't know it would be your business. If I had known, would you have recused yourself?" "I might have. But now—" He paused. "Now I have to be as objective as possible." Elizabeth looked at her old friend. They had once been inseparable. 3 law students. She, Thomas, and William. They dreamed of changing the world, of making it fairer. "Do you remember our vows?" she suddenly asked. At graduation, we promised to always stand by the truth. Thomas sighed heavily. Liz, I can't. I'm not asking you to break the law, she interrupted. I'm only asking you to look at the facts, all the facts. She took an envelope out of her purse. Here, take a look. These are documents about all the charitable projects of our network. I have been managing them for the last 15 years. A program to support young mothers, scholarships for students, help for animal shelters. William called it a waste of money. Thomas took the documents. I will study them. But you realize that you have to be impartial? Yes, I understand that. And I'm not asking for a favor. I'm asking for justice. When she returned to Robert's office, he looked at her carefully. Are you sure that was a good idea? I don't know, Elizabeth answered honestly. But I know Thomas. He has always been an honest man. And if there's a chance that he'll see the whole picture, what if Donovan finds out about this meeting? Elizabeth smiled tiredly. Then we'll have to fight even harder. But you know what, Robert? I've been fighting for what I thought was right all my life, and I'm not going to stop now. The next day after the conversation with Thomas, Elizabeth arrived at the headquarters of their coffee shop chain. At the entrance, she noticed an unusual buzz. Employees were gathered in groups, actively discussing something. Good morning, Mrs. White, Anna greeted her, but she sounded tense. Has something happened? You don't know yet? The secretary nervously crumpled a folder in her hands. Mr. White sent an email to all the employees. He announced a reorganization. Elizabeth felt her blood run cold. What reorganization? He had appointed a new executive director, a certain Miss Christina Parker. She's already here, holding meetings with the managers. Elizabeth froze. Christina Parker is the young woman from the photos, his mistress. Where is the meeting taking place? In a large conference room, but... Elizabeth was already walking to the elevator. About 30 people gathered in the conference room, all managers of their coffee shops. A young woman in a business suit was sitting at the presidium table, with William next to her. And so we decided to implement a new management system, Christina said. All decisions will now be made by... I'm sorry to interrupt. Elizabeth's voice sounded loud and clear. But I would like to know on what basis is this meeting being held? The room fell silent. William stood up. Elizabeth, this is a working meeting. You don't have to... I'm still a co-owner of this business, she said, moving closer. And any personnel changes must be approved by me. Christina smiled. Mrs. White, I have all the necessary authority. Here you go. She held out a folder of documents. Elizabeth quickly looked through the papers. It was a letter of appointment signed by William. And her. It's a forgery, she said quietly. I never signed that document. Are you sure? Christina pulled out another sheet. What about this power of attorney you signed 3 months ago? It gives Mr. White the right to make personnel decisions alone, Elizabeth remembered. Yes, she had signed several documents without even reading them, trusting her husband unconditionally. William, she looked him in the eye, do you really think you can just... This is business, Elizabeth. He cut her off. It's not personal. Nothing personal? She laughed bitterly. You put your mistress in charge of the company we built together for 30 years and say it's nothing personal? There were shocked gasps in the room. Christina turned pale. I think we should continue the meeting later, she said quickly. Oh no, Elizabeth raised her hand. Let everyone know the truth. Let them know how their esteemed boss is betraying not only his wife, but the company as well. William came up to her sharply. Enough! You're making it worse for yourself. I've already talked to the main suppliers. They support me, and the bank is on my side. What do you mean? I mean that if you don't stop this show, I'll freeze all the company's accounts. You'll be left with nothing. You wouldn't dare. I already have. He pulled out his phone and showed her the message from the bank. From now on, all account transactions require my personal signature. Elizabeth felt her legs give out. She looked around. All the managers were looking at her with pity and sympathy. Some looked away. And one more thing, William added. I know about your conversation with Judge Burns. It was very reckless of you. Donovan is already preparing a motion to recuse the judge because of your pressure on him. It was a friendly conversation. It was an attempt to influence the judge, he cut me off, and it could cost you dearly. Elizabeth walked slowly to the door, but turned back before she left. You know, William, for all these years I thought I knew you, but now I see that you are a stranger. And you know what's worse? You don't even realize that you are destroying not only our marriage, but our life's work. She walked out of the conference room with her head held high, although she was trembling inside. Anna caught up with her in the hallway. Mrs. White! Wait! I want to show you something. What is it, Anna? I found these documents by accident. The secretary looked around and lowered her voice. It seems Mr. White has been planning this for a long time. He was transferring company money to offshore accounts. And there's something else about Miss Parker. She's not just his mistress, she's... At that moment, William appeared in the hallway. Anna, come to my office. Right away. The secretary looked at Elizabeth in fright and hurried after William. Elizabeth stood there, clutching Thomas's business card tightly in her hand. Perhaps all was not lost. Perhaps the truth would prevail. That evening, Elizabeth sat in her home office, sorting through old documents. A phone call interrupted her thoughts. Mrs. White? It's Anna! The secretary's voice trembled. I'm sorry to bother you so late, but I've been fired. What? Fired how? Mr. White. He said I violated company confidentiality. He threatened to sue me if I told anyone about those documents. Elizabeth clutched the phone tightly. Don't worry, Anna. Tell me, did you have time to make copies? Yes, the girl whispered. I sent them to your personal email before he took my work computer. Good girl. Now, listen carefully. Tomorrow morning, meet me at Martha's Cafe, 2 blocks from the office. And don't be afraid. I won't let you get hurt. After hanging up, Elizabeth opened her email. What she saw in the documents left her breathless. William wasn't just withdrawing money, he had created a whole network of shell companies, and they were all registered to Christina Parker. Oh my God, Elizabeth whispered. I was so blind. Suddenly the doorbell rang. Martha, their former housekeeper, stood on the doorstep. Sorry for the late visit, Mrs. Elizabeth, but I have to tell you something. Mr. William came to see me today. William? Why? He offered me money. A lot of money. He wanted me to testify in court that you cheated on him first, with some business partner. Elizabeth felt her insides go cold. And what did you say? I refused, Martha exclaimed indignantly. How could he think I would lie, after 15 years of working in your house? Thank you, Martha. Elizabeth hugged the old woman. You have no idea how much this means to me. The next morning, an unusual group gathered at Martha's Cafe. In addition to Elizabeth and Anna, 3 other managers from their coffee shops came. We're with you, Mrs. White, said Karen, the manager of their very first coffee shop. What's happening is wrong. We all remember how you personally trained us, supported us, and helped us in difficult situations. Mr. William is trying to rewrite the entire history of the company, added George, the financial manager. But we know the truth, and we are ready to testify in court. Elizabeth looked at these people and felt tears welling up in her eyes. Thank you, but you are risking your positions. And you risked it when you hired me as a single mother with 2 children, Karen interrupted her. Everyone else said no, but you believed in me. At that moment, Anna's phone vibrated. It's the office. Miss Parker has sent out a new order. She's firing all the senior managers. She says it's an optimization. Optimization? George laughed bitterly. She's just getting rid of anyone who remembers the real history of the company. Elizabeth stood up decisively. All right, listen up. I will not let them destroy what we have built over the years. I have a plan. She took a folder out of her bag. Anna, the documents you found are just the beginning. We need to trace all financial transactions for the last year. George, can you help us? George, sure. I still have access to the accounting system. Great. Karen, I need you to contact all of our old vendors. I need copies of all the contracts I personally signed with them. What about the employees? Karen asked. Many are afraid of losing their jobs. Tell them I'm filing a counterclaim. And if I win, the first thing I'll do is reinstate everyone. With compensation. Suddenly, the door to the cafe opened and a young man walked in. Mrs. White, I'm on behalf of Judge Burns. He wants you to come to him immediately. It's about Mr. White's attempt to have the judge recused. Elizabeth nodded. Tell him I'll be there in an hour. When everyone left, she sat at the table for a long time, looking at her ring. 32 years. How much things have changed. But one thing she knew for sure was that she would not lose this battle. On the way to court, Elizabeth received another message. It was a photo of William and Christina leaving a jewelry store. A new wedding ring sparkled on the young woman's finger. Nothing personal, you say? Elizabeth whispered. Well, we'll see. The day of the trial was gloomy. Elizabeth had come early and was now sitting in the courtroom corridor, looking over the documents George and Anna had prepared for her. Are you ready? Robert, her lawyer, asked, sitting down next to her. More than ready. She handed him a folder. Take a look at this. We found evidence that William had been preparing this plan for almost a year. At that moment, William appeared in the hallway, accompanied by Christina and his lawyer. Christina was dressed in a modest business suit, but her engagement ring was still sparkling on her finger. Elizabeth, William gave her a cold nod. It's not too late to come to an amicable agreement. Accept my offer, 20% of the business and a good compensation. Amicably? Elizabeth stood up. After you tried to bribe Marta to lie about my infidelity? Christina nervously tugged at William's sleeve, but he ignored her. I don't know what you're talking about. Really? What about the offshore accounts? You don't understand that either? William paled noticeably. That's slander. You have no proof. I have everything. Elizabeth smiled. Every document, every translation, and today the court will find out about it. Everyone to the courtroom, the bailiff announced. When everyone was seated, Judge Burns called the hearing to order. William's lawyer was the first to speak. Your Honor, Donovan began, we are dealing with a simple property division. Mr. White has been the de facto head of the business for the last few years, while his wife has been involved only in representative functions. He pulled out some documents. Here are the network development reports for the last 5 years. All the key decisions were made by my client. All contracts were signed by him. Mrs. White was only a nominal figure. I object. Robert stood up. We have evidence of Mrs. White's active involvement in the management of the company. Elizabeth listened to their argument and then asked for the floor. Your Honor, I would like to say something personally. Judge Burns nodded. Please do. Elizabeth stood up and walked to the podium. The room fell silent. 32 years ago, William and I started this business in a small coffee shop. We had no experience and no money, just a dream and a desire to work. I personally served customers, made coffee, created menus. She pulled out an old notebook. Here are my diaries from those days. Every recipe, every invoice, every idea, everything is written here. And here, she showed other documents, are the charitable projects I've been running for the last 15 years. Programs to support young mothers, student scholarships. That's all very touching, Donovan interrupted her. But where is the evidence of your involvement in business management now? Oh, there is! Elizabeth nodded to Robert, and he began to hand out folders. Over the past year, my husband has created a network of shell companies. All of them are registered to Miss Christina Parker, whom he recently appointed as the executive director of our network. Shocked exclamations were heard in the room. Christina turned pale. Significant sums of money were being withdrawn through these companies. Here are documents from our suppliers. Invoices were issued for inflated amounts. The difference was transferred to offshore accounts. William stood up abruptly. This is not true. You have no right. Sit down, Mr. White, Judge Burns said sternly. Go on, Mrs. White. Moreover, Elizabeth pulled out another document. Here's a power of attorney that I supposedly signed 3 months ago. It authorizes Mr. White to make all decisions for me. But I never signed this document. This is the conclusion of a graphology expert. These are serious allegations, Judge Burns said. Mr. Donovan, does your client have anything to say? But before William could answer, the courtroom door opened. 2 men in suits entered. Excuse us, Your Honor, Financial Police. We have a warrant for the arrest of documents of the Paradise Company and all related entities. We suspect large-scale financial fraud. William stood up. This is a provocation. She set this up. Calm down, Mr. White. One of the policemen approached him. "We also have a warrant for your arrest until the circumstances of the case are clarified." Christina, who had been sitting in silence all this time, suddenly grabbed her bag and rushed to the exit, but the second policeman blocked her path. Elizabeth watched this scene with a sad smile. She did not feel joy or triumph, only bitterness at how low the man she once loved so much had fallen. "The court is adjourned," Judge Burns announced. "All of the company's assets will be frozen until the investigation is complete." As they began to leave the room, Thomas met Elizabeth's eyes for a moment. There was a silent message in his eyes. "Hang in there. The truth is on your side." A week passed after William's arrest. Elizabeth was sitting in her home office, sorting through company documents, when the phone rang. It was Robert. "Have you heard the news yet?" The lawyer's voice sounded excited. William had been released on bail. Elizabeth clutched the phone tighter. "Who paid the bail?" "You won't believe it. Christina's parents. It turns out that her family has serious connections in business circles. And that's not all." "What else?" "They filed a motion to reopen the trial. And you know what's most interesting? Judge Burns granted it. The hearing was scheduled for tomorrow. The next day, the courtroom was packed. In addition to the usual participants in the trial, there were many new faces. Representatives of the press, businessmen, even a few local politicians. William looked tired, but confident. Christina was sitting next to him, and behind them was an elderly couple, apparently her parents. The man in the expensive suit was constantly writing something down in a notebook. When Judge Burns entered, everyone stood up. His face was impenetrable. "Before we proceed with the case," he began, "I would like to clarify a few things. I have received a motion from Mr. White's counsel to recuse myself on the grounds of possible bias. There is also an allegation of pressure from Mrs. White." Donovan smiled smugly, but the judge continued. "However, during the forced recess, new circumstances have come to light. Court reporter, please distribute the documents." The bailiff began handing out folders to everyone present. Elizabeth opened hers and froze. These were bank statements. "As you can see from these documents," Judge Burns continued, 2 days ago, a transfer of $500,000 was made from the account of the Emerald Investments Company, owned by Miss Parker's family, to an offshore account. The recipient is a company whose beneficiary is my assistant. A whisper went through the room. Christina turned pale. Obviously, someone thought they could influence the court's decision in this way. But they did not take into account one thing. My assistant immediately informed the court security service. Christina's father stood up. "Your Honor, this is some kind of mistake. Sit down, Mr. Parker. I'm not finished yet." During the investigation of this transaction, other interesting facts came to light. It turns out that similar transfers have been made regularly over the past year. The recipients were various officials who were responsible for making decisions regarding the Paradise coffee shop chain. The judge took out another document. "Here's a certificate from the bank. The total amount of transfers is more than $3 million, and all this money was withdrawn from the company's accounts through a complex system of shell companies." William jumped out of his seat. "This is slander! I demand—" "Sit down, Mr. White." The judge's voice became icy. "You will still have the opportunity to explain everything, but already within the framework of the criminal case." Elizabeth looked at the man she had once loved and could not believe that this was really happening. In his eyes, she saw no remorse, only rage that his plan had failed. "And now for the motion to recuse me," Judge Burns continued. "Yes, I knew Mrs. White when I was a student, as did Mr. White, by the way. We all went to school together, and that's why I know the history of their business better than anyone." He pulled out a yellowed photograph. "Here we are, 32 years ago, at the opening of the first coffee shop. I witnessed how Elizabeth worked 18 hours a day, how she created the menu, how she developed the concept of the place. And you know what's most interesting? There is someone else in this photo." He showed a picture of the hall. "Do you see this young girl behind the counter? This is Marta, who later worked for 15 years in their home. The same Martha whom Mr. White tried to bribe to testify against his wife." Martha, who was sitting in the audience, stood up. "That's right, Your Honor. And I'm ready to tell you under oath how Mr. White offered me money to testify falsely." "Thank you, Martha." The judge nodded. And now I would like to hear the testimony of one more person. Please call Miss Anna Thompson to the stand. When Anna entered the courtroom, William visibly tensed. Miss Thompson, could you tell the court how you found the financial fraud documents? I accidentally saw these papers on Mr. White's desk, Anna began in a trembling voice. He forgot to hide them when he was rushing to meet with Miss Parker. There were transfer schemes, lists of companies, and then I noticed that the amounts in the official reports did not match the actual receipts. And what happened next? Mr. White found out that I had seen the documents. He fired me and threatened me with legal action if I told anyone. Judge Burns looked at William carefully. What do you have to say to that, Mr. White? But William remained silent, clenching his fists. The trial continued. After Anna's testimony, the room was tense. Judge Burns was looking through some papers, and Elizabeth was watching Christina, who was nervously whispering to her parents. The court calls the next witness, George Henderson, the judge announced. George, their financial manager, walked confidently to the stand. Your Honor, as the company's financial manager, I noticed the first discrepancies 6 months ago. At first, it was small discrepancies in the reports, then strange transfers. Why didn't you report this to Mrs. White immediately? The judge asked. Mr. White explained it was because of the new tax optimization system. He said that Mrs. White knew about it. At this point, Christina suddenly stood up. I want to make a statement. Her father tried to stop her, but she pulled away. No, Dad. No more lies. William turned sharply to her. Christina, sit down. Your Honor, she ignored William. I want to tell the whole truth. Judge Burns nodded. Please, Miss Parker. It all started a year ago. Her voice trembled. I was working at a coffee shop. William, Mr. White used to come in there a lot. At first, it was just talking then. She paused for a moment, collecting her thoughts. He told me about his plan. He said he was tired of sharing the business with his wife, that he wanted to start a new life. He invited me to be a part of this plan. And you agreed? The judge asked. Yes. Christina looked down. He promised that after the divorce we would get married, that I would become a co-owner of the chain. My parents? They helped with the financial operations, used their connections. William jumped to his feet. Shut up, you have no right. Sit down, Mr. White, the judge said sternly. Continue, Miss Parker. The plan was simple. Gradually withdraw assets through shell companies, and then, using Mrs. White's power of attorney, re-register most of the business. But the real goal was not even money. Christina looked directly at Elizabeth. He wanted to get back at you. He said that you were always too controlling, that the company's success was solely his own. The room fell silent. Elizabeth felt her breath catch in her throat. But the worst part, Christina continued, pulling out her phone, is this. She handed the phone to the judge. There are recordings of our conversations. He wasn't just planning to take your business. He wanted you to be left with nothing. He planned to falsify the embezzlement documents so that you could be prosecuted. William stood up and ran for the exit, but the bailiffs blocked his path. Sit down, Mr. White. The judge's voice became icy. It looks like we'll have to call the prosecutors. Elizabeth sat there as if petrified. 32 years of marriage, and all this time. Your Honor, she suddenly said, may I speak? Judge Burns nodded. Elizabeth slowly stood up and looked directly at William. You know what's the saddest thing? If you had just come and told me that you didn't love me anymore, that you wanted to leave, I would have understood. We could have resolved everything in a human way. But you chose a different path. She took an old photo out of her purse. Do you remember this day? The opening of our first coffee shop. We were so happy, so full of hope. What happened to you, William? When did money and power become more important than anything else? Something like shame flashed in William's eyes, but he quickly composed himself. You don't understand. I deserved more. I made the company successful. Really? Elizabeth smiled bitterly. And who came up with the concept for each new coffee shop? Who personally communicated with customers, listened to their wishes? Who created a program to support young mothers among our employees? She looked around the room. Look around you. All these people are our team, our family. And you were ready to destroy everything for the sake of your ambitions. At that moment, 2 policemen entered the room. Your Honor, one of them said to the judge, we have a warrant for the arrest of Mr. William White on suspicion of financial fraud and attempted grand larceny. Judge Burns nodded. The court is adjourned. All the case files will be transferred to the prosecutor's office. 3 months passed. Elizabeth stood at the window of her office in the Paradise Corner headquarters, watching the fall rain. On her desk was the latest issue of the local newspaper with the headline, William White sentenced to 8 years in prison for financial fraud. Mrs. White, excuse me, Mrs. Elizabeth. Anna, who had returned to her position as her personal assistant, knocked on the door. Everyone is already in the conference room. Elizabeth nodded, taking one last look at her reflection in the window. After the divorce, she had returned to her maiden name. Now she was Elizabeth Green again. And it seemed right. All the managers of their coffee shops gathered in the conference room. Karen, George, other loyal employees, everyone who had supported her in her time of need. Thank you for coming, Elizabeth began. Today is an important day for our company. The court has finally confirmed my ownership of the entire network, but that's not the main thing. She looked around the room. The main thing is the changes we are implementing. Starting today, 20% of the company's shares will be distributed among employees who have worked with us for more than 5 years. There was a murmur of approval in the hall. We are also expanding our charity program. Now each coffee shop will have a special menu of good deeds. Part of the proceeds from these items will go to help single mothers and students from low-income families. What about the new coffee shops? Someone from the audience asked. Oh, that's the most exciting part, Elizabeth smiled. We're opening 5 new establishments, and each will have its own unique concept developed by our employees. After the meeting, Karen came up to her. You know, Miss Elizabeth, I was talking to Christina the other day. Really? Elizabeth tensed. Elizabeth, yes, she works as a waitress in a small restaurant on the outskirts of town. She said she wanted to start over, and she wanted me to tell you she's sorry. Elizabeth nodded thoughtfully. Tell her I hold no grudges. Sometimes we all make mistakes. The main thing is to find the strength to recognize them and move on. In the evening, after a day at work, Elizabeth walked home. The rain had stopped and the city was filled with freshness. She stopped at their first coffee shop. Everything was different now, with a new design and modern equipment, but something unchanged remained in the atmosphere of the place. She was greeted at the door by Marta, who was now in charge of the place. Good evening, Mrs. Elizabeth. Your favorite table is free. Thank you, Martha. Sitting at her old table by the window, Elizabeth took an envelope from her purse. It was a letter from William, the first and only one she had received in a long time. She stared at the unopened envelope for a long time, and then stood up and threw it in the trash. Can I get you anything else? The young waitress asked. No, thank you. Elizabeth smiled. You know, I just realized something important. Sometimes you have to let go of the past to move forward. She went outside. The evening sun was painting the city in warm colors, and there were still many things to do. Tomorrow, the opening of a new coffee shop, then a meeting with suppliers, a presentation of the charity program. Everything is just beginning, Elizabeth whispered as she walked home. And in her purse was a new diary, clean, ready for new plans, dreams, and victories. Because life, like good coffee, has many flavors, and the most important thing is to be able to enjoy each of them.